The final death faction for AOS 4.0, the Soulblight, arguably my favourite and definitely the one I have the most knowledge and experience with, are the final focus of the followers of Nagash. And there is a lot here that is familiar, a little bit that is something new, and in my opinion anyway, quite a lot to get excited about. So the Soulblight Gravelords, kind of like the Nighthaunt, have always had a pretty busy set of battle traits. It's where a lot of their uniqueness and army power came from. And similarly in 4th edition, we look to be getting quite a lot of those rules back. The Soulblight battle traits still give you the majority of your healing and your recursion, as well as their updated and admittedly slightly toned down Deep Strike style mechanic. The hunger is here first of all, rather than on the individual war scrolls, and that kind of makes sense. It saves a bit of space in the long run, and it gives your vampire units that have fought in that turn the ability to heal D3 or 2d3 health if they've destroyed an enemy unit with a fight ability. Now this is now at the end of the turn rather than immediately after you fight, so you do need to survive the hits back to get this going off, and it is not based on the number of wounds that you do, the amount of damage you do now. It is just a d3 or a 2d3 roll. So in some ways it is a bit worse. It's harder to get that flat 6 heal on your big things like a zombie dragon, and also the fact that you have to survive that fight phase to get it means you can be killed before you get to heal up. But equally, this can be better in some ways too. Even if you just do 1 damage to an enemy unit, you will still now be getting that D3 health back. So you can potentially be getting 3 health back now, even if you just do 1 damage to an enemy unit. So in some situations, it may work out a little bit better, but I would say it's arguably a tiny bit weaker than it is currently. We also see the return of Deathly Invocation and Endless Legions. Invocation is now once per turn in any hero phase. So this now goes off in your and your opponent's turn, which is brilliant. It has been limited, however, in that you pick a single hero and then you choose 3 Death Rattle or Dead Walker units wholly within 12 inches of that hero, and then they each heal 3 or return 3 healths worth of models. So it is a lot more contained now. You do have to pick that one hero to be the focus of it. You can't just heal 3 random units across the board near 3 random heroes. And you also no longer get the +1 model back if you are near a gravesite, because gravesites aren't a thing anymore. But the fact that this now goes off in both turns means you can be getting back 6 models rather than the maximum of 4 in each battle round that you could in 3rd edition. So it is still a very, very strong rule, and I like the fact that you don't have to wait till your next hero phase, your next turn, to get this going off again. The fact that it goes off in each hero phase means that you can potentially keep your units trucking even if you've taken a bit of damage and you potentially get double turned. You still will have that chance to heal up a few models before you take another round of hits. So this is going to keep your roadblocks around a bit longer and mean your hammer units like your Graveguard will just stick around to do their damage for as long as possible. Endless Legions has also changed and is no longer a 4-up roll anymore to let you return a destroyed summonable unit. Instead, it now costs a command point, and in your movement phase, you can choose a unit of Death Rattle or Dead Walkers that has been destroyed and return a replacement unit of half strength within 12 inches of a Soulblight hero or wholly within 6 inches of a terrain feature and 9 inches from enemies. Now, if you do this in your movement phase, they can be set up 3 inches from enemies instead, but you can't charge. So you can't just put a unit right next to the enemy and charge in, but still this is amazingly good for blocking potential enemy charges in their next turn, or jumping near an objective and trying to steal it, or just getting right in the way and blocking up the enemy movement lanes. It is still a very, very good ability. The fact it costs a command point now is obviously a downside, but I do like the fact that it is guaranteed rather than on a 4+ roll now. It does make it, in my opinion, slightly more worthwhile. I cannot tell you the number of times I have gone an entire game and not brought a single unit back because I have failed every single one of these rolls. So it being a command point is a downside, but I like the reliability in that when you need that half strength unit back, you know that you just need to pay a command point to do it rather than roll a 50-50 dice odd. I would say many people might think it's just a side grade overall, and I can see where they're coming from, but I think personally, for me anyway, it does feel a bit better, and I think either way you look at it, whether you think it's a side grade or not, it's still a very strong, very useful ability for the Soulblight to have. Finally, as mentioned earlier, grave sites are indeed gone. Instead, your deep strike ability of the Unquiet Dead lets you, as it does now, put units off the board and then deploy them from the grave using the Rising Dead ability, and this allows you to set up one of those units 9 inches from enemies and wholly within 6 inches of any terrain feature. So you can now set them up not just near a gravesite, but from any terrain feature on the battlefield. So this does potentially give you a bit more playing room to set up your units, because in 4th edition, from what we've seen, it does look like there is a set sort of a layout to the terrain, and there is plenty of it in most of the battlefields. So I think that does kind of make up for the loss of grave sites a little bit, although I would say the big thing for me is that losing the grave sites is a big thematic loss. I loved setting up grave sites. They were just nice to bring units on. It kind of felt like you were raising the dead from where they were actually kind of laid to rest. So I do think thematically it's a bit of a shame, and I would say overall it is a bit of a loss, but it's still going to be really useful to have this ability to bring units in from reserve and get them set up near to the enemy across all the terrain features on the battlefield, to disrupt their battle plans or score you secondaries. The battle formation that we see, the Death March, is all about your death rattle, and the rule Tide of Bones and Blades is really good if you are running a skeleton heavy list. It gives you +1 rend to your melee weapons for friendly death rattle units that have charged that turn and that outnumber their enemy. So this can, to be fair, be a bit tricky to pull off. You do need to get that charge off and you do need to outnumber the enemy, but skeletons or graveguard with probably a 20 maximum unit size, and even black knights with a probable maximum size of 10 models can outnumber quite a lot of enemies. Small infantry units or even monsters are going to be very easy to get this buff onto, and then giving them +1 rend to their attacks is incredibly strong. Graveguards specifically, as our premier hammer unit, will love this bonus. It's going to mean on the charge they will still very, very likely chew through pretty much anything that they touch. So it is overall a great formation in my book. It does require going heavy into the death rattle to really make the most of it, but if that is your jam, and it does look very cool, like I love the skeleton stuff for the Soulblight, and if, as the rumor engine showed off the other day, we are potentially getting new Graveguard, they could be a very good addition to slot into this formation. So if you like that kind of playstyle, this is going to be very good, and it's going to make even your humble skeletons much scarier in combat. In terms of their spells, we see the Law of Undeath and we see the Vile Transference spell. This has got a bumped up casting value of 7 rather than 6 now, but it does have an 18-inch range over the 9 it had in 3rd. You still pick an enemy unit, but instead of rolling a number of dice equal to the wound characteristic, it is now based on the number of models in the enemy unit, and on each dice roll of a 6, you do 1 mortal damage to that enemy. On top of that, if you do kill any enemy models, you heal D3 health. So it's gained some range and is now a bit more of an anti-horde chaff clearer spell. It's less good into those big multi-wound monsters, but now much better into things like a big unit of goblins. Against a unit of 20, you are still only looking at around 3 to 4 mortal damage though, so it's not exactly going to wipe a unit out, but it is a decent spell, and you could potentially kill off a couple of infantry before you get a charge in, which may be just the little edge you need to completely wipe out the unit. And then of course getting that little bit of healing on your caster from a safe 18 inches away is just a nice cherry on top. The war scrolls we got to see today start with Radukar the Beast, who is still just as terrifying as ever. He has his 8-inch move, 12 wounds and a 4-up save. He's not gained any attacks, but his claws are now 3 damage instead of 2, and they do still have the mortal damage part of their profile. So alongside his bloodborne companions, his total damage has jumped from 24 to 30, which is a very nice increase, and he really is going to be fantastic at bringing down anything from big units of infantry all the way up to enemy monsters. He still gives a bonus to friendly units when he's charged, but now instead of an extra attack, any Death Rattle, Deadwalker or Virkos Bloodborne units wholly within 12 inches get +1 to wound for the turn. It is arguably a little bit less good than a whole extra attack like he has in 3rd, but getting a bonus to wound isn't a bad buff, and it will help things like your zombies and skeletons actually do some damage in combat now, rather than just rolling a load of dice and doing absolutely nothing. He also has his once per turn ability in the Beast Will Out. This still gives him a d6-inch move. It doesn't require him to take any wounds now, which is nice, but it is only at the end of turns rather than at the end of any phase, so it can't go off multiple times in a single turn anymore, but it's still very, very powerful, and it's made even better because it states he can move into combat with this. So at the end of the turn, you can potentially move him d6 and get into combat with an enemy to prevent them moving in their following turn, setting them up for a charge or whatever, so you can really disrupt an enemy battle plan by just popping him into combat and basically shutting down that unit from what they were planning on doing. Finally, he is also a wizard now, which is great because he wasn't one before, but unfortunately, his War Scroll spell is the only thing you are probably going to cast with him, and it is just his old passive ability. He no longer has supernatural reflexes. Instead, the new Armor of Night spell is a 6+ to cast and grants him that same -1 to be hit and -1 to be wounded. This only lasts until the end of the turn as well. Now this is obviously a fairly substantial hit because a lot of his durability is now tied to getting this cast off. So he can be a lot more vulnerable to enemy attacks now. The -1 to be hit and to be wounded made such a big difference to his survivability in 3rd edition, and I would personally rather he wasn't a wizard at all, but just still have this ability baked into his War Scroll, because to me, he does feel really quite squishy now, even with those 12 wounds, because he only has a 4-up save and the 6-up ward to protect him, and you can't rely on that -1 to be hit and -1 to be wounded anymore. So yes, he does hit a bit harder, yes he can move into combat now to disrupt enemy plans, but his own personal defenses are a lot more random now, so whether or not he is going to be worth taking, I think we will just have to wait and see. Another named character who's had some big changes is Laukavai. She's dropped to a 10-inch move and also dropped to a base 4-up save rather than her old 3-up, so 2 immediate nerfs there, which is a bit annoying. She has also lost some attacks, her impaling tail is gone completely, and otherwise she's kept the same 5 attacks from her rapier and 3 from her talons, so she is still killy, she's just not as killy as before. She still gets to reduce rend from enemy attacks with Nightmare's Miasma, which in addition with generally reduced rend across the board is actually quite nice, and it helps to make her new 4-up save slightly less depressing, I suppose. It's still kind of depressing, but just slightly less depressing. And then she does also have her own unique rampage now in Impaling Talons. This does kind of replace her Impaling Tail attack. It lets you, if she has charged this turn, roll a dice, and if it is equal or less than the enemy health characteristic, they take that much damage. So this is obviously going to be fairly rubbish on 1 health enemies, but on anything with 7 or more health, this will automatically go off, and even against those 4 or 5 health elites, things like Varangard and that sort of thing, this will go off most of the time and could do a decent amount of damage. The average on a d6 roll is 3.5, so you will likely do around 3 or 4 damage to most enemy units that have 4 or more health. Finally, she also gets to keep her spell, the Queen's Diktat, which is a casting value of 6, but now only has a 12-inch range. It lets you pick a friendly monster which is wholly within range, and you can add D3 attacks to one of its companion attacks. So this doesn't give you a bonus pile-in anymore, but an extra D3 attacks could be quite impressive, especially on things like a zombie dragon with its maw or its claws, which are a fairly good profile. Elsewhere, Blood Knights haven't changed that much at all, which, I mean, I guess whether that's a good thing or not, I leave to you. They are still 3 wounds and have a 3-up save. They do now have a 12-inch move instead of their old 10-inch, which is nice, but their Templar weapons are only rend 2 against infantry now. Against all other targets, they are just 1 rend. But that does mean they are still fairly solid at charging into infantry and wiping them out. A unit of 5 will do around 11 damage to a 4-up save unit on the charge, so they can quite reliably wipe out small infantry squads, because that's not even counting the extra 15 horse attacks either. They also still get the Riders of Ruin, which allows them to pass through enemy infantry models, but they can't end a move in combat, and then they get a new rule which is kind of tied to the old rule. Trampled to Dust is where they do their damage after those moves. So in the charge phase, you pick a unit that you've moved over in this turn and you roll a d3, and on a 2+, they do that much mortal damage. So it is similar to how it is in 3rd, it's just infantry only rather than specifying units with a wound characteristic of 3 or less. So it's probably not realistically going to make a huge difference, because most of those 3 or less wound units were going to be infantry anyway. They are still kind of okay, I guess. They can do a decent amount of damage and they do admittedly look awesome, but I think they're going to be very much points dependent as to whether we actually see them on the battlefield or not. Finally, we get to another red-headed stepchild of the Soulblight, the Vargeists. With the same 4 health and 5-up save, they are still very, very squishy, and they still have 3 attacks with their talons, but they are actually a little bit worse in melee now. They now only hit on 4s rather than 3s, and they are still 1 rend and 2 damage with the crit 2 hits rule. So they are overall less powerful in melee, and they were already just kind of mediocre in 3rd, so that is a bit of a pain. They can still do their movement shenanigans with Death's Descent. However, this has changed. Instead of being a deep strike deployment mechanic, this is now done in any of your movement phases, and they can be picked up and set back down on the board again 9 inches from enemies. So they are much more mobile now. They can move from objective to objective in your movement phase to claim them, or they can move around the board to score you some battle tactics or get behind enemy lines to set up for a charge next turn. So I would say overall, yes, they are less killy, but Death's Descent is now actually much, much better for them and really will help you use them to score points and get battle tactics done. So I do think that they are not as good in terms of killing stuff, but they do have a bit more value now from the objective kind of game in the new edition. And that is the Soulblight. Overall, I am a fan of most of these changes. I think more could have been done to make the War Scrolls a bit more exciting, because I think overall they've lost a little bit more than they've gained, but I do still think the battle traits are solid. There is a lot of healing, a lot of recursion still in this army, and I do think the Soulblight are still going to be really quite strong and a very, very fun army to play in 4th edition. But, as always, what do you make of these rules? Let me know all of your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.